So Quang Nguyen from the state of Arizona. Are you there?
Yes, sir, I am. Thank you for
Fantastic.
having
Now you are you're a representative. You're in the so we call it the assembly here in California. You guys call it is that the equivalent in Arizona, a representative?
the equivalents. So we're the House of Representatives, and there are 60 of us. Right as of right now, in 2024, after the November election, we're sitting at 33 Republicans to 27 Democrats. We came up 2 seats after being 31-29 for 4 straight years.
That's right. And you
Wow.
are a Republican and just got
Yes,
reelected, right?
yes, sir.
That's awesome. Congratulations. And you and I met at the policy conference when you were here in San
So,
Diego for Second Amendment Foundation.
yes, sir. That was a great event.
It was a great event, and I got to tell you, I was really the coolest thing about the event. I love the event. I love going and hearing the speeches and everything, and the buffet after was awesome. But the best part of the event is that I get to meet really interesting people like yourself. And my understanding of your story is, first off, you're an extremely passionate Second Amendment advocate, and of course, you are you're an elected official in Arizona. You've won awards for being Legislator of the Year for being so pro Second Amendment. But then I started to hear and read more about your history, and you are I would describe you as a refugee from Vietnam back in the 70s. You escaped Vietnam to come to the United States. Is that accurate? Is that how you describe it?
That's correct. I was one of the very few lucky people to be able to leave Vietnam just 6 days before the fall of Saigon. So I was born in 1962. So I went through three major communist invasions: 1968, 1972, and 1975. And I didn't enjoy any of it, if you can imagine. So people
Well,
ask
talk
me,
about that. What specifically? What changes did you notice? What things were actually happening to you as a citizen in Vietnam?
well, when you're growing up in Vietnam, it's amazingly when people say, I'm sorry you had such a rough life, but I would then actually argue against that. Life is life. You don't know any better. You wake up, there's a war going on. You go to school, there's a war going on. You go to bed, there's a war going on. And you hope to God that you don't hear bad news about your dad or your brothers serving out in the battlefields. So that was my life. I don't think about freedom because I never knew what it meant. I don't think about where my food is going to come next. I hope I have another meal the next day, or be above ground the next day. And so it's you survive as a child. You survive, and I was able to remember a lot of it because I was almost 13 years old when I left. And so when you talk about me being really a strong advocate for the Second Amendment, I didn't even know what the Second Amendment was until I learned how to read in English and
Right.
understand the rights and the Constitution. And then I realized that, hey, maybe I lost my freedom because we didn't have something similar to the Bill of Rights and the Second Amendment.
Well, how
And so
and
that's
I think that's another interesting. I love that perspective, and I want to talk about it. But before we get too far away from your past, talk about like were things noticeably worse when you were five, or I'm sorry, when you were 13 than when you were five. You know what I mean? Like, did you notice a progression of things getting worse around you? As the war escalated, as things started to really truly fall apart.
absolutely, absolutely. You during the Tet Offensive, it was an uprising in every town, every village in South Vietnam, and so I was able to see the battles like up front, up close. I remember being on top of the tree, looking at cobras flying around, puffing away, if you know what I mean.
Cobras
Um,
being the
and then
American attack helicopter.
Right, right. So you get closer to the fall of Saigon. You're beginning to hear more sounds. You're beginning to feel more rumbling of the B-52s going off. And I remember I used to play with a game where I actually sit at my desk doing my homework, and feeling the rumbling of the B-52s from 300-400 miles away. I don't think any kid should go through that kind of stuff. And it was the game for me to catch my pencil as it's rolling off my desk.
That must have been terrifying.
Wow.
It was, but you got used to it. So I don't know if I can use this as an analogy. I remember when we had an earthquake, and all the kids are supposed to be under the desk, at school. There was an earthquake, and I was the only kid that was sitting at my desk, and everybody went down below, as they should, right? And I'm looking at it, and I'm like, well, this rumbling is only about 5 or 10 seconds, and everybody freaked out. I'm used to the half an hour rumbling. And so it never bothered me that there was an earthquake going on.
So there were so many different sides and factions. You had, two sides, the communists in Vietnam, you had the anti-communists in Vietnam, you had the Americans, you even, probably weren't even aware, but there was some, Russian influence. There was, Chinese, there was Laos, there were so many different factions. When you were growing up, did you have an impression of who the good guys are, who the bad guys are? Was that
Absolutely. So if I may go back to history for a little bit, we had over 1,500 years of war in Indochina. So you got Mongolia, you got the Chinese occupation for over 1,000 years, and then you have the occupation of the French for 180 years or so. And then you have Americans coming. And by the way, before Americans came, there were Imperial Japan during World War II, right? And then you have Americans coming, and they were the only force that I can actually say they were not occupiers.
And you were aware of that as a child.
Yeah.
Yes, and I realized that very quickly. Why? Because my dad fought side by side with Americans. My two brothers, one was an airborne captain and one was an army medic, and they fought side by side with Americans. So that was about the only time when I actually could say Americans were the good guy and still is the good guy. And so I formed that opinion quite early in my life.
So when you're 13 years old, Saigon falls. How did you get out, and how was it determined that you got to get out, and how did you get out?
Yeah, so my dad was a lieutenant colonel, but he retired back in '73, which is 2 years before the fall of Saigon. And I remember he picked me and an older brother up from school, and he's when he retired, he was given a Willie. So it's kind of cool that he's got a Jeep that he could drive around after retirement. And he picked us up and he dropped us off the Tân Sơn Nhất airfield, and he said, "See that C-130 over there? You're gonna get on there with a bunch of people, and you may not ever see your mom and dad and your siblings again. So just here's the bag of clothes, go."
Wow. And what was on the other side of the C-130? The C-130 landed in America at some point, I'm assuming.
Yeah, so the C-130, basically, it's a long route, man. It took me to the Philippines, and from the Philippines, we got onto a 747 parking. There were a line of 747s waiting for refugees for the first 100,000. And so I got on that thing, and it flew to Guam, and I was there for vetting and also vaccination for about 7 days there. And then eventually they flew me into country, which is Travis Air Force Base. And then from there to Camp Pendleton, and then on to Fort Chaffee, Arkansas. So I was floating around quite a bit.
Now, did you see your dad again?
Yeah. So what happened was my mom and dad and the rest of my siblings were floating on a barge on April 29th, which is half a day before the fall of Saigon. So they got onto a barge and they floated out of the Saigon River. And once they got out to the Pacific Ocean, there's a USS Miller just sitting right out there. And they were so lucky to have that Navy ship sitting out there. And they were scooped up.
I can't even fathom that. So looking back as a child, like you said, that was just how life was. So you didn't really have anything to compare it to. But as you got settled in the United States, looking back on your first 13 years under communism, what was it? What are some things what are some things that are different? You know, as far as like food and what you can and can't say and your rights and your freedom. What are some things that looking
Yeah,
back you were
something
like, oh my gosh,
interesting.
I can't
I
believe we went through
want to
that.
make it clear though that I do want to make it clear that I never lived under communism. I lived in a communist war. But
Interesting.
yeah, but the fear is there because I remember growing up, and I'll get back to the United States part. But what I remember growing up is that my mom and dad said to me, "Don't go to school and share with your classmates what your dad does for a living," which is he was a lieutenant colonel working with Americans fighting the same war. And then I have an older brother who was an airborne captain. And no, we don't disclose that kind of information because you just don't know which kids had parents who are on the other side, the VC or the NVA. And so, yeah, there's not much talking in terms of what we do as a family, who we support. Do we support Americans? We don't talk about that. We were told very little that we don't talk about stuff like that. When I came to the United States, I realized that there's actually enough food to eat. There isn't a fear of are you going to get the next meal tomorrow? That fear just disappeared, right? And then right after I went to high school, I realized that hey, we can actually make fun of President Carter
Without
and
fear
not be
of retribution or going to jail.
exactly. And so recently I gave a speech on Veterans Day, and this is what I actually said. The measure of freedom is depending on your ability to criticize your government. If you can criticize your government and not be taken out, you have real freedom.
You know, it's so true. One of the things you touched on that I think is so important. Typically, when you watch movies, there's definite good guys and there are definite bad guys. You know, somebody's in the black hat and somebody's in the white hat, and the person on the other side is completely and totally evil. Then the person who's the good guy is completely and totally good in every way. But you touched on something there. I mean, you're going to school with the same kids whose parents are absolutely in favor of communism, and would have reported you had they known, whatever your stance was, or at least you lived in fear that was a possibility. So you shared a neighborhood, you shared transportation in a school or whatever with people who had the exact opposite opinion of you when it comes to communism. Is that accurate? Is that what you were indicating as far as?
Yeah, so that's pretty accurate. So I have mixed feeling when somebody said, see something, say something, because in Vietnam it's the opposite of what we say here. I remember when my mom was living under communism in North, was born in Haiphong, and she said to me, see something, say something is how they operate. So your neighbors will tell on you. For example, she gave me an example. She had 5 chickens in the backyard, and she cannot butcher them for food unless she gets official permission from the local authority, right? And if you didn't do that and you secretly kill one of your own chicken for a meal, then your neighbor could report you that, oh, well, I saw 5 yesterday, but only 4 today. What happened? So that's the kind of see something, say something we had in Vietnam under a communist war. Or actually under communism in North Vietnam. And so I have mixed feelings about it.
Mixed feeling. So mixed feelings mean you kind of have you can kind of see both sides, or there's pluses and minuses on both sides. Is that what you
right.
mean? Or
In the United States, people say, well, see something, say something. And I automatically revert back to what my mom told me.
So you can see the value of like, hey, yeah, if you see if you see a crime or you see something bad going on, you see the value in, hey, bring it up and say something, but you
Correct.
also see the danger of people reporting their neighbors for not saying or doing something dangerous, but for saying or doing something that is simply on the opposite opinion of the government. Is that
exactly? And so, yeah, if you see a crime, if you see obviously you see somebody building a bomb or whatever it is, yeah, I would definitely do that. But I, you know, living two lives. I mean, half of my life here, half of my life there. Um, you get mixed messages in your head, and sometimes you kind of revert back to what you've learned before. And so I'm very methodical about the way I think. I really have to think through things in order to make sure what is the right thing to do and what is the wrong thing to do. I certainly don't want to report on my neighbor who has a Trump flag flying,
right?
right? Or a Second Amendment flag flying.
Or for that matter, a Biden flag flying.
Right. And I think that's what the left might be leaning towards.
Yeah.
Right. If you have a conservative message, a bumper sticker, I don't want people to report on me on my First Amendment rights. And I think that Bill of Rights that we have is incredible. The only country in the world that has a long-lasting constitution. And this is the reason why I adore and I will do anything I can to protect the Second Amendment.
Hey, Quang, I have a question.
Yes, sir.
You said, you made a distinction that you grew up in a communist war and that you didn't want to, let your classmates know what your parents did for for their occupation. What do you think would have happened to them if it became public knowledge?
Yeah, so I remember when I was very young when my mom said this to me. She said, we like to open our doors, the front and the back, just to get the wind blowing through. And she said, it wouldn't take much for somebody to ride a scooter by and toss in a hand grenade.
Wow.
That was a real possibility.
That was a big possibility. And I have a brother, like I said, he was a Vietnamese airborne officer. And as soon as he gets home, he's out of uniform because he doesn't want to be recognized as an airborne officer. I mean, he's out in the battlefields probably 6 or 8 months out of the year. And so that's what we live with. We live in a very careful way, even though we were in South Vietnam.
So 2010, 2011, somewhere around there, kind of this woke movement started. A lot of politics on the left took an even harder left turn, and a lot of things happened since then. COVID and the BLM riots, and Trump and Biden, and now Trump again. Do you see? Is it hyperbole to compare this period of history in the United States with some of the things you witnessed when you were growing up in Vietnam when the communists were taking over? Is that hyperbole, or do you see some similarities?
Well, let me just say this, and I, as the chairman of judiciary, I have to deal with facts. I can't be in the middle somewhere. I have to, either it's fact or it's not. So when you talk about the Vietnam War, you have to understand the politics behind the Vietnam War, okay? We have the Paris Peace Accords. We have an agreement that says that every bullet spent, every plane crash, every helicopter destroyed will be replaced by Americans. And who reneged on those promises? It was the Democrat. It was the 93rd Congress. And then it was again supported by the 94th Congress. So clearly that the Democrats did not want us to exist. And if you look at after the Vietnam War fell and we have a Democrat president in 76, so what happened to the killing fields? The killing fields happened between 1976 and 1978, where 2 million people were slaughtered in the fields.
So
Okay.
can you when you I know the history of the killing fields, I know what you're referring to, but can you give a few more details? What exactly when someone hears about the killing fields in Vietnam, what exactly are what exactly happened? Talk about the details there.
All right. Let's go to the political details first. Okay.
Okay.
So war was defunded by Democrats. I'm talking about both the Vietnam and the Cambodia campaigns were defunded by the Democrats. And those Democrats were who? Joe Biden. They were Ted Kennedy. They were the people that are, believe it or not, running the country today after 50 years. Think about that for a second. So, me as a child growing up, I understand who defunded that war. Now, so let's look at the fact. Did any of these people ever come to us and said, we made a mistake? The defunding of the Cambodia campaign, the Cambodian campaign caused 2 million people to be killed. Has anyone on the left side ever come up to me or you or the public and said, you know, blood on my hands? Never said that. Okay? So there you have it. Why? The Pol Pot was basically emboldened by the fact that the United States government, not the military, abandoned Vietnam and Cambodia. And I'm very emotional when I talk about it. Okay? And if you look at Cambodia, why did it happen? Communism happens, it doesn't just happen because somehow somebody ran for office and got it. It's about total control. And you can see this is approaching that Second Amendment thing. You can't control people who are well-fed, educated, with firearms. You can't control those people. So the first thing you have to do is you have to control the food source. Then you got to control the guns. And then Cambodia happened because somebody decided that if you have an 8th grade education or higher, you shall be killed because we don't want smart people to be able to fight. That's how drastic it was. That's how drastic it was. So they took teachers out, they took engineers out, they took doctors out, they took nurses out, they took everybody that had an 8th grade education and higher and slaughtered them. 2 million people in 2 years. And I hate to say this, but when's the last time you hear people talk about the killing fields?
Yeah, very rarely. It's kind of part of the reason. I don't think people remember. And when I was growing up, I certainly read a lot of books by Vietnam vets, and I was, it was fascinating to me in the late '80s and the early '90s. But I don't think it gets talked about. It's almost forgotten history at this point. And there's been so much that has happened since, but so many similarities to what did happen. For example, do you see similarities between Vietnam, and everything that happened in the 60s and 70s, and the Ukraine? Do you see similarities there, or do you think it's a totally different situation?
I think it's somewhat different situation. Vietnam happened for a different political reason. I mean, you have the South Vietnamese soldiers or army being supported by Americans, and then you have the other side being fully supported by the Soviet Union and China. People forget China was involved in the Vietnam War, as well as where do you think those T-34 came from? Right, those tanks.
The tanks, the Chinese, yeah.
And the VC were driving. They came from the Soviet Union at the time, and so way I look at it is it's not quite the same. The United States is now supporting Ukraine, dumping billions of dollars in there, and for a guy that actually worked on aerospace, I kind of secretly, and not secret anymore, but I kind of enjoy the fact that we are exposing the weaknesses of the Russians.
Of Russia, sure. Mm-hmm.
Through that war. So for somebody that worked at Northrop Aircraft at one time, I kind of giggle about it a little bit and understand, but man, we're talking about wasting a ton of money there, and we're not closing our border. Now, I'm okay. Hey, listen, man, America first, right? Close that border. fentanyl, human trafficking, sex trafficking. I have to deal with those issues daily at the House of Representatives.
Yeah, governing in a border state, I would imagine.
Yeah, absolutely, and I will tell you, it's not fun being here in a border state when you see that we have a governor that won't do anything. You remember that Governor Ducey, before he left office, he actually put those containers out there to block part of the border. I mean, the current governor removed them all.
Jeez.
Wow.
So it's interesting that you have come to the Second Amendment and as a supporter, not, I would say, not because it was a hobby of yours, not because you grew up hunting with your grandfather, and you just have an interest in guns or whatever. You came to it for a very political reason, for a life-saving reason. I think that you have a different profile than a typical Second Amendment supporter, or a typical gun owner. Is that the reason? Is that tell us what would the United States be like if we didn't have the Second Amendment, or what is your fear of losing Second Amendment rights?
I don't think you would have that microphone in front of you right now if we didn't have the Second Amendment and the left was to take over the country, the nation. You wouldn't have that microphone. I wouldn't be sitting here on a laptop talking to you. That's my worst fear. And being who I am as an individual that came out of the war, I resort to the lowest point of my life as the baseline. And then that's what I don't want us to go as low as I can. But I've been so low that I can actually look up and say, I'm going to fight to make sure I don't ever come back to this low point again. And I don't want you to be there. I don't want your children to be there. I don't want your grandchildren to be there. I want my grandchildren to be there. Because at the end of the day, the helicopter isn't going to be at that rooftop for you and me in the United States, because where do we fly from here?
Yeah.
So that's where my mentality is all the time. So the Second Amendment isn't, you're right, it isn't about a hobby. It's not about my shotgun. It's not about the 1,000+1 drum that I spoke of at the conference. But it's more because politically, we will not survive if that was to go away. And I said this all the time. Here in the media in Arizona, they refer to me as the guy that wants to expand the Second Amendment. That is not true at all. I'm not here to expand the Second Amendment. I'm here to try to crawl back what was taken away from us.
It's interesting you say that. It's so interesting you say that, because I just, right before this segment, made the mistake of saying expand the Second Amendment and actually had to casually correct myself. You're absolutely right. We're looking to preserve it, not expand it. We want to get back what was taken from us.
Yes, sir.
That's awesome.
And the other thing that, I belong to a political party that actually supports the idea of protecting the Second Amendment. But in so many ways, I wish all 31 or 33 of us at the State House would say, let's be on the radio. Let's be on the program. Let's learn about, just when I got into the room, you were talking about Bruin. Understand what Bruin is. Understand what Heller is. Understand what McDonald is. I wish we would all understand so that we can fight. And I say this all the time to kids when I speak at high schools. If you don't understand your rights, you cannot defend it. And I think too many of us legislators are not paying attention to the details of what's happening at the court system on a daily basis, on the weekly basis, when it comes to defending the Second Amendment.
Excellent point. Truly appreciate you doing so much to fight. I appreciate you giving us the time and coming on and telling your story. Absolutely fascinating. Do you have a website? Is there some place where people can find out more about you, or anything you'd like to drive people to?
Right. You can go to Q or Quang, Quang, for FOR Arizona, or actually use number four. That's okay. So quangforarizona.com. You go there and you can see some of the bills. And by the way, I just want to say this. I said this at a conference, and you both heard me. Arizona is protecting the Second Amendment industry. You cannot file a frivolous lawsuit if a gun is misused or illegally used. I think we might be the only state. So, if you have any manufacturing companies listening to you, Arizona is the place to be. You can't be sued.
Excellent. Well, thank you for doing so much that you've done, Quang. Keep up the good work. Keep up the fight. And I'd love for us to keep in touch with you, and let us know if there's something else that you need to promote or something else that you guys have done or anything. Gun Owners Radio would love to get the word out to our listeners. So thank you so much for everything you do.
Real quickly before I sign off,
sure.
We got about 30 anti-gun bills introduced for January of 2025. 30. Now, if you and I were to sit down, we couldn't come up with more than 5. Right. I promise you and I were sitting down in a room. We locked ourselves up with a big giant pot of coffee, and Rich too. We could not come up with 5 anti-gun bills. These guys came up with 34 last year, 30 this year.
It's amazing. And Arizona has progressively gotten less pro-Second Amendment over the last 10 years. So it's not like it's a slam dunk that you guys are going to have to work to overcome a lot of these. There are definitely some folks in government in Arizona that disagree with you. Seems like it's centered around the cities. The further away you get from Phoenix, right, from downtown Phoenix, the better, right, the voters are. But still, it's not a foregone conclusion that you guys are going to defeat these things. So you definitely need help.
And by the way, those 34 gun bills that we had last year introduced in 2024, this 2024 session, none of them saw the light of day.
Good.
Nice.
Congratulations.
So
great job, Quang. Well, thank you so much. Appreciate it. Keep up the good work, and thank you so much for joining us and telling your story.